Can you hear me at the back? Can you still hear me? Is that too loud? Michael may not actually need the microphone, because he's got a much louder voice than I do. Michael Champion is a lecturer. Sorry, Michael Champion's a lecturer in classics and ancient history. I'm launching straight in for reasons I'll come to in a moment. He's a lecturer in classics and ancient history. He's been with us, I think, now for 3 years. A bit longer than 3 years. His book has just been published by OUP, and I noticed from the website this morning that he's got what looks like about 6 or 7 chapters coming out in various people's books elsewhere this coming year. So, immensely active member of the department. He's going to be talking to us about Justinian's empire today, but because he's got something else on today, he's double booked. I thought we'd launch straight in. Instead of me doing my usual 5-minute introduction, I just launched straight into let him talk, let him have a cup of tea if he has time for it afterwards, and then he can go on to his next appointment. So if you'll bear with me, I'll come back later to what the programme for this season is after Michael's finished and we've had our afternoon tea. So with that, I give you Michael Champion.
Thank you very much. Is that picking up my voice all right at the back? Excellent. Well, this makes a... Oh! You can all go to sleep, yes. Shall we go to 50%? 50%, I think that might be better. This makes a very pleasant change from what I'm doing for the rest of the day, which is training students at St George's College to be good student leaders. And I'm very pleased to be here today. I think this is a fabulous group and it's been such a good support for classics here. So thank you all very much for coming. Justinian. Well, he came to power effectively when his uncle Justin did. Justin was, however, an illiterate swineherd. This is how Procopius describes, so there's Justin on a coin, and here is how Procopius describes Justin. He says, he succeeded to the throne, though he was by now a doddering old man, totally illiterate. In popular parlance, he didn't know his ABC, an unheard of thing in a Roman. It was the invariable custom that the emperor should append his own signature to all documents, embodying decrees drafted by him. Justin, however, was incapable of either drafting his own decrees or taking an intelligent interest in the measures contemplated. The official whose luck it was to be his chief advisor used to decide all measures as he himself thought fit. But to secure the authority for these in the emperor's own handwriting, the men responsible for this business proceeded as follows. On a short strip of polished wood, they cut a stencil in the shape of 4 letters, spelling legi, that is, I have read, and they used to dip a pen in the special ink reserved for emperors and place it in the hands of the Emperor Justin. Next, they took the strip of wood and laid it on the document, grasped the emperor's hand, and while he held the pen, guided it along the pattern, he couldn't even do that himself apparently, of the 4 letters, taking it round all the bends cut in the wood stencil. Then away they went, carrying the emperor's writing, such as it was. So here is Procopius. We'll hear a good deal more from Procopius. He's the major classical historian who records Justinian's empire in his books on the wars and on the buildings. He's also the author of a scurrilous piece called The Secret History that was never meant for publication, in fact wasn't published during his lifetime. It was discovered in the Vatican in the 17th century. Where he attacks Justinian very strongly. But he was very close to the emperor. So even you can pull out snippets from The Secret History and get a fair idea of some of the things that were going on. He also has Justinian wandering around with his head detached from the rest of his body, going from council meetings, walking around the corridor in a demonic form. I think part of what's going on there is this, the optimism that starts Justinian's reign, the activity, the successes, the reconquest of the West that we'll talk a bit about, the codification of the law project, the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia, the successes against the Persians. All those happened fairly early in Justinian's reign. The later part of the reign is less successful. The so-called eternal peace that Justinian negotiates with the Persians lasts about 8 years. There's a whole series of natural disasters at the end of his reign, and part of what we're getting then in Procopius's more scurrilous accounts of the empire are responses to the decline, the dissipation of the empire, I guess, at the end of Justinian's rule. But Justinian's was the golden age of the later empire, at least at the start. He was a tireless and effective administrator. That's the truth of Procopius's slander that he never slept. The later Roman Empire, well, all Roman emperors, but the later Roman emperors had to be extraordinarily active, and they were involved in a wide range of activities: letter writing, administration, overseeing military campaigns, maintaining the coinage and the economy, lots of an expanded range of imperial ceremonial, and a wide variety of public patronage activities. Justinian himself didn't enter battle, but he oversaw many successful campaigns against Persians, Vandals and Goths, and also deviant elements within the empire. The Christian chronicler John Malleus talks about Justinian's efforts to suppress homosexuality in the empire. He had people executed, he had them exiled, and Malleus says, and there was great fear amongst those experiencing homosexual lust. There would have been, but so there was that element that we won't go into much today at all. There are 4 major things that I want to talk about today, 4 themes by which Justinian's empire is defined. There's the reconquest of the West. If people know anything about Justinian, here are 4 things. Reconquest of the West, there's the codification of Roman law, and I'll also talk a little bit about some of his wider social legislation. The rebuilding of the great church Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom, and in that context I'll talk a little bit about his wife Theodora and the Nicaea riots. The closure of the academy in Athens, the great philosophical school founded by Plato, was closed by Justinian. There's one other thing, of course, which people might know about Justinian's reign. It was the first outbreak of the plague during his reign. When I was drafting this, I wrote, thought by many perhaps wrongly, to be Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. But there's an article in the Lancet, 28th of January of this year, that claims evidence that a strain of Yersinia pestis, now either extinct or unsampled in modern times, was responsible for the deaths of some people in Bavaria in the 6th century, which would fit the outbreak of the plague and link it to bubonic plague. The strain is distant from the 2nd and 3rd outbreaks, the famous Black Death one and the late 19th century one that started in China. And the researchers say that their research is showing that the Justinianic plague and the Black Death were independent emergences of rodents into human beings, but they reckon, they're one of a long line of researchers who reckon that they've got evidence that the Justinianic plague was Yersinia pestis. I'm not going to talk much about that, but it fits into the wider narrative of decline in Justinian's Rome, or Justinian's Roman Empire, because the first outbreaks of the plague come in the second half of his reign, and they probably had an effect on the population. The sort of minimum estimates are about 20% mortality, so it had a major effect on what people could do. First then to reconquest of the West. What have I got there? No. I want to be there. Would help. So here you can see, what have we got? We've got the extent of Justinian's empire after the West is taken back and after North Africa is taken back. So he manages to expand the empire considerably. On his accessions, military campaigns led by Belisarius and others against the Vandals in North Africa and the Ostrogoths in Italy and Dalmatia were soon initiated. The Reconquest of the West campaigns started sort of immediately after he concluded the eternal peace with the Sassanid Empire. North Africa soon fell to the general Belisarius in 533-4, and then the following 6 years saw ultimately successful campaigns to retake Ravenna. The renewed Persian threat took Justinian's attention away from the West for a time, but by the middle 550s, battles against the Visigoths and the Franks had secured the West for Constantinople again. So for the first time in a century, the Roman Empire was united, although at a massive, perhaps crippling cost, and that maybe also contributes to this decline that I'm talking about at the end of his rule. How did Justinian understand the reconquest of the West? It's not clear, you see, that the rulers in some of these Western kingdoms actually thought they were that far outside the Roman Empire. There are accounts of the emperors in the East sending the standards to the Goths in Rome and the Goths sending the standards back. They seem to understand themselves partly as sort of regent kings for the Roman Empire. What's in it for Justinian? The motivations, of course, were complex. There were, in both Rome and North Africa, there were pleas for help by deposed barbarian rulers. So the wars could be justified as the Eastern Emperor going to the aid of unjustly overthrown Roman rulers in the West. Procopius, in his classically influenced histories, though not so much in the vitriolic secret history, makes the Reconquest central to Justinian's image as Roman Emperor, deeply committed to restoring the empire to its former glory. And economic considerations must have played a strong part too, especially since taking back the Western Mediterranean and Northern Africa, of course, adds substantially to the agricultural resources of the eastern part of the empire. But Justinian's own spin on the reconquest of the West always emphasised his role as preserver of Christian orthodoxy. The Goths were heretics, and it was the responsibility of the Roman emperor under God, but not too far under God, to weed out heresy from the empire. The Goths and Vandals, after all, were Arian. So in the imperial accounts, the accounts that are closest to imperial sort of self-understanding of what's going on, the reconquest of the West is not so much presented as the unification of the whole empire as it is the act of a pious Christian emperor weeding out heresy. And it's significant then that the size of the army that was sent to take back Ravenna is approximately the same as the army that was sent to one of the provinces inside the Eastern Empire to beat down a group of heretics there. There are a couple hundred heretics there, but it was a big movement of the Roman army to try to create a religious orthodoxy. So it seems that by this stage of the empire, Christian ideology was at least that Christian ideology was at least, if not more successful than the idea of the classical Roman Empire in motivating and mobilising public support for important military campaigns. There we go. That's clever. Oh yeah, so here's, just before we move then to the Codification of Roman Law, here's a mosaic from Ravenna. And you can see, you can see a hand here on the pillar that's been blotted out by this curtain. what's happened there, there's probably been an Arian ruler depicted in the mosaic, and when Justinian's forces take back Ravenna, the first thing to do is to blot out any evidence of heresy. And there's a little bit of evidence for it. Where are we going? Yep. So a similar idea, though, about conflicting motives, so going back to the classical idea and drawing on new Christian ideas, can be seen when we turn to the massively influential project to unify and codify Roman law, which was also undertaken in the early years of Justinian's reign, sort of between 529 and 534. How should we understand this project? Well, certainly, it must be partly about an emperor trying to restore traditional Roman practices and extend his own authority by linking his power to the age-old institutions of Roman law. So, like the Reconquest, again, you can understand the codification of Roman law as an attempt to unify a disparate empire and maintain a stable order based on the unchanging Roman practices. He's in good company. Diocletian was a pretty good administrator, whatever else one says of him, and he put together a couple of codices of Roman law. Theodosius, one of the more successful later Roman emperors, had put together a large codex of late Roman law in the late 4th century. So Justinian was also placing himself in a long tradition of what a good emperor ought to do. The codification project was, of course, partly needed because of a proliferation of rulings and laws that have been made by emperors, but also by governors all around the Roman world. So there was a perceived need to have some greater consistency in the legal framework of the empire. So there's a sort of standardisation of the law and a unification of the empire by making a standard set of laws. It makes the empire uniformly, consistently Roman. But again, there's another element, and in the imperial proclamations and prefaces to the law, it's quite clear that there's another sort of ideological underpinning to the codification of the law process. The laws, say Justinian, were compiled with the assistance of the eternal God. He characterises the codification process as an example of divine philanthropia and divine generosity, and his own philanthropy to his empire is like the divine philanthropy that is making possible the codification of the laws. So this rhetoric that tied imperial legal authority to divine authority continues throughout Justinian's reign. All laws, for example, were to begin, Justinian instructed his lawyers, by an acknowledgement of God as the creator. And they were to be dated, so this is the sort of divine authority of law, but they were to be dated first to the year of Justinian's reign, not to the traditional dating systems by consul or by year from the foundation of the city. So there's this centralisation of the laws that goes there. When a legal commission found an ancient dispute about whether the judgments of emperors ought always to be considered law, Justinian wrote, "The emperor shall justly be regarded as the sole maker and interpreter of the laws." So this rhetoric goes only so far. Yes, the laws were made under God. Yes, they were, and yes, that's important for imperial power, to tie yourself to your imperial authority, to divine authority. But he gives people no wriggle room. The emperor is the sole maker and interpreter of the law. But one of the things I want to point to is this connection between the rhetoric Christian rhetoric involved in the Reconquest of the West project and in the Codification of the Law. Christian rhetoric in this period is essential for shaping monumentally influential imperial decisions and imperial actions. It's perhaps most obviously seen in this monumental building, which is Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Work on the new church was required fairly early in Justinian's reign too, because the old one had been destroyed in the Nicene riots, which I'll say a little bit more a bit later on. The work on the church was exceptionally fast. It took less than a month to clear the rubble of the old church from the site. Within 6 weeks, the building had commenced. Within 6 years, the church was so close to being finished that it could be consecrated. Just to put that in perspective, Salisbury in England, one of my favourite cathedrals, took 110 years to be completed. The construction began in 1220, the spire was finished in 1330. For such a massive church to be substantially built in 6 years is just staggering. Justinian, we're told, was at the building site every day. This was his personal project. Here we have Justinian presenting the church to Mary, the Mother of God. Here's Constantine on the other side giving his city to the Virgin. So we've got Constantine, the great emperor among the saints, on one side, and Justinian, the famous emperor, on the other. It's a 10th century mosaic. I haven't got any pictures from Hagia Sophia from the 6th century. So, of course, this church is now, was taken over as a mosque, and a lot of the decoration altered. The fabulous 6th century mosaics, you can see, of course, are in Ravenna, but that's another story. The haste of construction is probably something that saved the church from earthquake. It seems that he didn't wait for the bricks to dry sufficiently, and that actually gave the building a little bit more flexibility so that it managed to withstand or substantially withstand earthquakes. The original dome was not so lucky. It fell in 558 during an earthquake, but was put up again fairly quickly. Here's some contemporary accounts of the church. Rising above the circle is an enormous spherical dome which makes the building exceptionally beautiful. I've got that there. Just a little bit more of this. It seems not to be founded on solid masonry, but to be superseded from heaven by that golden chain, and so cover the space. All of these elements do not allow the spectators to rest their gaze upon any one of them for a length of time, but each detail readily draws and attracts the eye to itself. Thus the vision constantly shifts around, and the beholders are quite unable to select any particular element which they might admire more than all the others. And then the bit that I've got up there when everyone goes to church and so on. Or from Paul the Silentiary, he says, "The roof is compacted of gilded tesserae, from which a glittering stream of golden rays pours abundantly and strikes men's eyes with irresistible force. It is as if one were gazing at the midday sun in spring, when he gilds each mountain top." What we've got here are fairly traditional, standard rhetorical accounts. The rhetorical device here is the ekphrasis. It's supposed to move the eye through the image and make the image come to life and start to move. That's what an ekphrasis does. It makes images move. And here you can see the idea of mosaics, the Byzantine aesthetic of these shimmering mosaics is partly influenced by this rhetorical practice, this rhetorical ideal that a good description, a beautiful thing, ought to be able to move. And there are all sorts of techniques that mosaicists use to make the light seem to shimmer. They set the tiles at different angles. This is all part of this particular aesthetic. Just a couple of pictures from here. Here's a virgin and child that probably replaced a cross from the iconoclast period. That's the other reason that it's hard to show 6th century decorations. There's a period of iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire where all iconic representations are defaced and replaced with all people are taken out of images, replaced with a cross is about as good as you can get in the iconoclastic period. So here's a 10th century Virgin and Child. This one's an interesting mosaic because it's been changed several times. Christ is in the middle. You can see Jesus Christos written there, flanked by the Empress Zoe on one side and her third husband, Constantine X. And both the head of the emperor and his name above him have been changed in this little bit in here. And then there's some sort of dubious reworking of the head and neck in that area to as Zoe moved from husband to husband and her political fortunes changed, the imagery had to change too. But again, what we've got for our period is clear evidence of the importance of Christianity for imperial power. The church was built immediately after the most dire threat to Justinian's rule in the Nicaea Riots. Its rebuilding helped to cast Justinian as God's faithful regent and thus helped to re-establish his authority. Across the empire, of course, the period from the middle of the 5th century through to the middle of the 6th century is where you get a massive church building project. In the immediately preceding period, you sort of tore down a temple, let it stay in rubble for a while until you build in this next period started to rebuild churches around the Roman world. Hagia Sophia is the jewel in the crown of church building in the period. It's a testament, of course, to the power of Christianity, its increasingly strong ties to imperial authority and the wealth of the Roman Empire in this period. So then to the final theme about the empire, the closure of the academy. A group of archaeologists in Athens have years ago now, came across a house they claimed was the house of Proclus, the Athenian philosopher of the 5th century, pagan philosopher of the 5th century. It almost certainly isn't Proclus's house, but what they found there was really quite interesting. There were inscriptions with philosophical vocabulary. There were several statues of philosopher heads. There was a statue of Isis. There was a shrine for Cybele, and in the biography of Proclus by his disciple Marinus, we're told that he prayed especially to Cybele and rejoiced exceedingly in that worship. And there's in Marinus' Life of Proclus, there's also a good deal of evidence that Proclus's philosophy wasn't merely theoretical in the sense, or merely rational, in the sense that he also participated in theurgy. He thought that the intellect could get him so far, and then he needed some religious ritual that would make him leap up into the higher realm of sort of super-rational experience to find truth there. For Proclus, the universe was full of gods, he said. In the universe there hovers the super-celestial and immortal radiance leaping forth from the roaring fire that congregates at the source. Here's the language of sort of ecstatic union with the divine that's part of theurgy. And this house of Proclus is supposed to have contained a ritual grave of a sacrificed piglet, complete with remains of offerings, including a lamp with an image of Eros embossed in it, vases and a sacrificial knife. And we know that from the immediately following generation in Marinus seems to have lauded Proclus's religious piety, and the other philosophers immediately after Proclus in Athens seem to have engaged in a whole range of pagan practices too. Elsewhere, so one way of understanding Justinian's closure of the academy then is as an attack on pagan religion rather than an attack on Greek philosophy as such and Greek rationality. From Gibbon's great attacks on Byzantine Christianity onwards, there's been this strand of understanding of the period from Justinian on into the Byzantine world that they were a load of irrational Philistines who brought in the Dark Ages. But what I want to suggest is that there was a particular religious problem in the academy at Athens for Justinian. And just like the Codification of the Law, just like the Reconquest project, Justinian is seeing himself as the person responsible for maintaining religious orthodoxy in the world, and Athens stood out like a sore thumb. That sort of reading seems to be strengthened by the fact that elsewhere in the empire, philosophy and classical education went through a period of renaissance, really, I guess, during Justinian's reign. Constantinople had chairs in philosophy, rhetoric, Greek and Latin. Alexandria had publicly funded positions in medicine, philosophy, rhetoric and grammar. Gaza had a flourishing rhetorical school, and members of the Gazan school had interests in Aristotelian biology, in Aristotelian physics, and knew Neoplatonic debates about the creation and eternity of the world and the pre-existence of the soul pretty well, and wrote about them. So I want to show you a few pictures of the auditoria at Alexandria. This is a massive educational precinct built up against the bathhouse in the centre of the civic space of Alexandria. They've excavated, the Polish team has excavated over the last 15, 20 years now, about 36 classrooms, I think, and one large public lecture theatre. And there's a sort of colonnaded garden in the middle of the process. It's a massive public investment. There's also, as I said, funded chairs in various disciplines. It's a massive public investment for which, of course, they expected a fair return from the students that came to study in this educational complex. So classes would sit around here. The teacher sits up here. Zacharias Scholasticus says that the teacher sits especially pompously and sophistically at the top of this seat, looking down on the poor student. There's a block, in each of these classrooms there's a block about here. And we don't know what it's for, but my guess, not just my guess, but a plausible guess is that this is perhaps where a student stood to do his rhetorical exercises, declaim his speech. Who knows, might just be an odd bit of masonry. Here's a couple of other little pictures to give you an idea of the size of these. Here's the sort of public lecture theatre venue, another view of it. So why did Justinian close the academy in Athens? Well, given that classical education remained absolutely essential for any position in the imperial bureaucracy, given that classical education was increasingly required for administration in the church, as bishops took a wider role in civic administration, and given that education flourished elsewhere under Justinian, it probably isn't an attack on classical education. It should instead be understood, I think, as an attack on the particularly sort of aggressive and visible display of paganism in the Athenian philosophical schools. So there's our four elements of Justinian's reign. For the rest of today, I want to talk a little bit about Theodora, Justinian's wife, about the Niccar riots, and a little bit more about Justinian's social legislation. So, the Nicar riots. Not a bad way, perhaps, to introduce Theodora. The cause of the riot were many. They included increased taxation, but riots were not unheard of in this period. They were quite common, of course. They're often tied to violence of the circus factions. The immediate cause of the riot was the botched execution of two troublemakers, one from each of the main circus faction, the Blues and the Greens. They were to be hanged, but the scaffold broke. They were saved. The crowd called for the emperor to pardon them, but Justinian refused to answer, and widespread riots broke out, with the two factions joining forces against the emperor. In the midst of the riot, Justinian dismissed the two nephews of the former Emperor Anastasius from the palace, suspecting them of a plot. One of them, Hypatius, was then grabbed by the crowd and declared emperor, and they led him to the hippodrome. And here is Theodora's speech. She says, as to the belief that a woman ought not to be daring among men, or to assert herself boldly among those who are holding back from fear, I consider that the present crisis most certainly does not permit us to discuss whether the matter should be regarded in this or some other way. For in the case of those whose interests have come into the greatest danger, nothing else seems best except to settle the issue immediately before them in the best possible way. My opinion is that the present time, above all others, is inopportune for flight, even though it might bring safety. For while it is impossible for a man who has seen the light not also to die, for one who has been an emperor it is unendurable to be a fugitive. May I never be separated from this purple, and may I not live that day on which those who meet me shall not address me as mistress. If now it is your wish to save yourself, O Emperor, there is no difficulty, for we have much money, and there is the sea, and here the boats. However, consider whether it will not come about after you have been saved that you would gladly exchange that safety for death. As for myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud. When the Queen had spoken thus, all were filled with boldness, and turning their thoughts towards resistance, they began to consider how they might be able to defend themselves if any hostile force should come against them. And Justinian ends up sending in the troops into the hippodrome, slaughtered about 30,000 people. Hypatius and his brother were executed, and the conspirators had their property confiscated and were exiled, and the threat to Justinian's empire was over. So who was this extraordinary woman who's supposed to have made such a stirring speech? Well, if you believe Procopius, she was a notorious prostitute. Here's part of, I spare you the full gory details, but here's part of his salacious account. He says, often in the theatre too, in full view of all the people, she would throw off her clothes and stand naked in their midst, having only a girdle around her private parts and her groin. With this minimum covering, she would spread herself out and lie face upwards on the floor. Servants on whom this task had been imposed would sprinkle barley grains over her private parts, and geese trained for the purpose used to pick them off one by one with their bills and swallow them. Theodora, so far from blushing when she stood up again, actually seemed to be proud of this performance. For she was not only shameless herself, but did more than anyone else to encourage shamelessness. Right? And it goes on and on and on. But as I say, I'll spare you the details. We can't entirely discount this reading. John of Ephesus, a great admirer of Theodora, described her as coming from a brothel. So her background was, she seems to have been from the very lowest of social backgrounds. Justinian wanted to marry her. He had Justin's wife to get past before he could do that, but when she died, he persuaded his uncle to pass a law where prostitutes could be reformed and they could marry. Prostitutes and actresses who repented and wished for a better life could marry, and so long as they were of the right class, they didn't have to petition the emperor. So that part of the law seems to be designed just for Theodora. There can't have been many former actresses in that category. Then there are a series of laws then, very briefly, that I wanted to run through during Justinian's reign that are directed towards women and prostitutes. And so there are a whole range of things. Punishment for divorce should be the same for a man as for a woman, whereas previously the woman had been punished more severely. A dowry should be unnecessary, and that a man should not refuse to marry a woman just because she had no dowry. And men had to pay their debts out of their own funds and leave the woman's dowry intact. There's a law against the incarceration of women for debt. Any woman who commits a crime that would otherwise cast her into prison sends her to a convent instead. You might say it's not much better, but there you go. When the Armenians were to come under Roman rule, Justinian decreed that they had to change their way of treating women, and this is the law, one of his novels. They must end inheritance by men, but not by women, as is their barbarian custom, and which is still more barbaric. They present custom which gives women to husbands without a dowry and lets them be bought by their intending partners. They are not the only ones who think in this savage fashion. Other peoples also dishonour nature thus and do violence to the female sex, as if it did not originate from God and contribute to the work of generation, but was something cheap, disregarded and deserving to be excluded from all honour. We therefore decree that the rule as to the succession of women in force among us shall also be in force among the Armenians, and so on. And there are also a set of laws that aims to make life better for women in prostitution. So no woman, not even a female slave, can be forced into prostitution. He set fines for those who tried to force women to return to the stage once they had left it. He legislated against rape, abduction or seduction of women. Even the rape of a slave, female slave, which had formerly been excluded from the definition of a stuprum, of a sexual crime. And it's intriguing, I guess, to think of the role that Theodora might have taken in framing some of those laws and pushing Justinian in that direction. So what do we have? We've got a period of enormous activity, enormous military activity on the front against the Persians. Fairly successful set of campaigns there and also in the west with the Reconquest campaigns that expanded the reach of the Roman world significantly, but put substantial strains on the public purse in the process. And that's one of the things that make the final years of Justinian's rule a period of decline. There's a lot of continuity of Roman law and expanding that and standardising that around the empire. There's also continuity in imperial administration, in imperial patronage, of course. But what I've pointed to, I guess, is one of the major ideological change here is the role that Christianity can play in the empire. So the absolute authority of the emperor was, of course, consolidated by the unification of the law, but it's also achieved by associating the sole rule of the Roman Empire with the absolute divine authority of the one God. And that emphasis on the unity of the emperor under the one God affected all elements of his policy, his military campaigns for the unification of the Roman world through to the closure of the academy on religious grounds, and drove aspects of his social legislation too. There's a brief little snapshot of the empire under Justinian. And you can see in many of Justinian's actions some of the changes that would end up moving the Roman world, the classical face of the Roman world, into the transformed Middle Ages. Thanks very much. Shall I want this?
Thank you very much, Michael. Since Michael is going off before tea and won't be back here to answer questions afterwards, he's very kindly agreed to do so now. So if you've got any questions, this is your opportunity. Otherwise, you'll have to ask me and you won't be satisfied with my answers, I'm sure.
Thanks. Yeah.
How cynical is one entitled to be about Justinian in regard to religion? Was it just a tool in his hands for his own personal power, or is there actual evidence of a profound religious belief?
So the question is about how cynical we should be about Justinian's religious belief. Is it deeply pious, or is it a matter of strategy? I think no emperor is able to be merely pious. All emperors have to think about how their policy will affect the whole empire, and he uses his religious policy to unify the empire. He takes the orthodox line against the Monophysites in the face of significant opposition from his wife, and she seems to be convincing him a bit by the end of his reign. He's starting to change his mind a bit. So it's not that elements of individual belief are completely irrelevant. But yeah, I think the major thing is, in his mind, is how is this going to help me consolidate my authority? How is it going to unify the empire? I think.
Did Justinian have power over the bishops of the church hierarchy?
So the question is about the relative power of the emperor as opposed to the power that bishops can wield in society. When an emperor in this period goes into Hagia Sophia, he has to take off his crown and hand it over to the Patriarch. So there's a sense in which the Church has its own realm of authority. And that's strengthened by the increasing role that bishops are able to take in the later Roman world as bishops become exercise philanthropy in their local communities in a similar manner to civic benefactions in the earlier period. One of the really interesting social changes seems to be about the sorts of people who are included in the community. In classical Rome, the political community is an elite community. And so if you want to demonstrate how powerful you are, one thing that you can do is put up a public monument in the city. Once you think that the civic community includes everyone down to the lowest slave, then you can show how powerful you are partly through almsgiving. And bishops are pretty good at this, giving grain out to local communities. Emperors do it too, Justinian does it. So bishops start to be able to wield authority in the civic sphere in a way, by this period, in a way that they couldn't even a few hundred years earlier. So there are, what's that to say? There are areas where bishops seem to have significant independence and significant social power. But Justinian involves himself very deeply in the major theological disputes of his day. They didn't talk about them, but there's raging disputes about Christology, how you should understand Jesus. And Justinian takes sides and he sends in the army. So there's a strong overlap too, where the imperial interests and church interests come together, converge.
How did Justinian get his throne?
How did he seems to be pretty secure when Justin dies. So Justin gets it in a sort of palace coup, effectively. But Justinian, so my first slide had that odd date for his reign, 518 or 527, whatever it is. 518 is when Justin claims power, but Justinian is important for a good deal of that period. And so often we sort of talk about the Justinianic period from earlier.
Was it during his reign that various architectural objects were salvaged from Delphi and Athens?
Yes, there is a... So this is a question about rescuing sculptures from Delphi and from Athens. I'm not sure of the details, but there's a lot of classical sculpture from Greece is brought into Constantinople pretty well from the start of the foundation of Constantinople by Constantine, but by successive emperors after that. Do you know more about that, David?
No, that's the answer I would have given.
Yeah.
Other than Hagia Sophia, was there any other major buildings that Justinian would have connected to Justinian?
Yeah, so there are major renovations, say, of the baths, and extra sculptures put up there. There seemed to be work on the educational complex too. There are other churches from the 6th century in Constantinople, pretty large churches too. What other buildings? The Hippodrome, of course, is pretty severely damaged in the Nicar riots, and the Hippodrome's right next to the Imperial Palace. There's a connection between the Hippodrome and the Imperial Palace. It's one of the things that makes it so dangerous to have tens of thousands of people rioting in the Hippodrome, because there's a direct connection between the two. There's a lot of damage there, so there's a lot of rebuilding then of those two institutions. Yes, he's extraordinarily active. There's aqueducts are built in the period. So there's this extraordinary activity, mostly in the earlier years of his reign rather than at the end, but it does continue through. Yeah.
Wasn't there a sort of a great natural disaster in Justinian's reign in Krakatoa, in the Indonesian islands? There was a bigger volcanic eruption than that in the 19th century, which created a great big dust cloud and crops failed.
Okay, so the question's about an eruption of Krakatoa and its effects in the Byzantine Empire, which I'd not heard. I do know that there are several earthquakes in the later years of his reign, significant crop failures.
I heard that there was crop failures due to the volcanic dust that blocked out the sun.
Uh-huh. I'll hunt that up, yeah. But certainly there are a series of things at the end, in the final 15 years of his rule, that puts the empire under significant stress. There's the fact that he's spent so much money on military campaigns doesn't help, but then there are failures of crops, earthquakes, and the civic destruction that implies, and of course the effects of repeated iterations of the plague, diminishing population significantly.
Should let you off the hook at that stage.
Okay.
Okay. Before Michael goes away, it's traditional to thank the speaker. We're always very grateful in this group to be able to draw on the expertise of people from much wider across the community here in Perth, and not just from within the university, but of course from across the entire community. It's been a great privilege to have Michael come along today, particularly since he'd already committed to something else. Especially when he's here talking about Justinian. I think he's the second longest reigning Roman emperor after the Emperor Augustus. He's on the throne for a long time. And as somebody who was brought up in his teens on Robert Graves' Count Belisarius, I've always been rather fond of the period. And when I was about 20, I had the opportunity in successive visits to go and spend some time in Ravenna, first of all, and look at the absolute magnificent mosaics there, and then staying in what today would be called a backpackers' hostel in a little street right next to Hagia Sophia in Istanbul in about 1969. Two things that left a tremendous impression on me as examples from the reign of the Emperor Justinian that are still there for us to look at today. I can't remember if Michael drinks, but I'm sure he knows somebody who does. He says he does drink. But thank you, Michael, for coming in today. We'll take a break now for afternoon tea, in inverted commas, since it's always much more than just tea. Can we meet again at 3 o'clock? So you've got about half an hour. Thank you.